Yes, hello everybody, and welcome to my presentation. I'm very sorry that I cannot be with you there in person, but I hope this will be possible in the near future. My name is Alexander Sack. I'm a professor of brain stimulation and applied cognitive neuroscience at Maastricht University, and I'm very happy to give this talk for the seminar of the Center for Applied Neuroscience in Cyprus. In the next 45 minutes or so, I would like to tell you something about our research with regard to non-invasive brain stimulation, and in particular, take you with me on the journey that we've made from basic neuroscience research using non-invasive brain stimulation to mental health policy changes that are now implemented here in the Netherlands, where I live and work. Let me start with a declaration of conflict of interest for your information. Well, this is a short picture of where we work in Maastricht in the Netherlands, Maastricht University Health Campus. You can see here above the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience, and also a hub in our Center for Integrative Neuroscience, where we do fundamental basic research using fMRI, EEG, but also non-invasive brain stimulation, using non-invasive brain stimulation techniques to do a basic research on the workings of the human brain and how human brain activities related to human behavior, cognition, and emotion, decision-making. And then we are very close to the academic hospital in Maastricht with the Department of Psychiatry, Neurology, and Neurophysiology, where we very closely cooperate with these different clinical departments to implement technological innovations that we develop, or new protocols or scientific evidence to directly apply those scientific insights into clinical applications for new treatments for various patient groups, but I come to that in a second. Well, there's neuromodulation is an extremely hot topic at the moment, and there are many technologies being developed and introduced in the field. Roughly speaking, you can distinguish between invasive neuromodulation technology, which is deep brain stimulation, neural implants, and so forth. And there's a category which we refer to non-invasive brain stimulation, which is often also called transcranial brain stimulation because it's applied through the intact skull transcranially. And the two most commonly used and heavily investigated techniques that we have available nowadays is TMS, transcranial magnetic brain stimulation, or TDCS, transcranial direct current stimulation, the one using strong magnetic pulses transcranially to modulate neural activity, and the other one using very low intensity electric current to modulate neural activity in the brain non-invasively. Just to start off with some basic facts for those of you who are not that familiar with these two techniques. You see here a picture of two TMS devices, so the transcranial magnetic stimulation technology. And in essence, what all of these devices have in common is that you have a stimulator, which is a machine that is a bank of capacitors that is capable of producing a very strong electric current that is then discharged through a cable into an electromagnetic coil. You see here two examples of such coils. They come in different shapes and different sizes, but all that doesn't matter for the moment. And these electromagnetic coils, this is copper wire inside where the current then flows very rapidly through this copper wire and is producing a magnetic field. And this magnetic field is then, if you place this coil, which with its plastic housing on the outside of the head of your patient or participants, this induced magnetic field is transcranially entering into the brain And because it's a magnetic field that is changing rapidly over time, so it's like a pulse, very rapidly it peaks and then it decays again. So it's a changing magnetic field. And because your neurons are exposed to a changing magnetic field, you will induce electric activity in these neurons via electromagnetic induction. It's a very simple physical principle. You see it here depicted. So I have this coil, I can hold it in my hand like a shower head. I can put it on the outside of my subject's head. And then I use the stimulating device to set certain parameters, but in essence, I'm transcranially sending a strong magnetic pulse into the brain. And because of this changing magnetic pulse, I can induce electric activity in the underlying neural tissue and thereby stimulate, make these neurons fire, literally induce action potentials in these neurons. That's how transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, works in essence on the physical side. You see an example of how that works. You see a PhD student of mine many years ago in an fMRI scanner doing a very simple finger tapping task. So she's tapping her right index finger, just 10 minutes in an fMRI scanner. I then can analyze her brain data, and I can very easily map or localize the area in her brain that is active when she's doing this right finger tapping. And not surprisingly, I see activity, significant activity in her left hemisphere, in her left central gyrus, so her primary motor cortex, which is controlling her right index finger tapping. So I have mapped the area in her brain that is active during the execution of this very simple motor task. Now I can re-invite this subject into my TMS lab. I'm standing behind her with a TMS coil in my hand. I'm using a self-developed fMRI-guided neuronavigation system that helps me to position the TMS coil in real time directly at the brain area that I want to stimulate. In this case, this area that I have identified to be active when she's tapping her finger. And now whenever I apply a TMS pulse, with every TMS pulse I apply to that area, I make her finger move. So now her finger is under my control, so to say. I turned the situation around. Instead of just measuring her brain activity, I now stimulate exactly this brain region. And because I know what the functional role of this region is, namely it is controlling the right index finger, by stimulating it, I can actually induce this behavior, this motor behavior in her. I make her finger move beyond her own control. This is a demonstration, a very simple demonstration in how TMS can actually stimulate the brain, triggering action potentials in the primary motor cortex. The signal is sending down the spinal cord all the way to the muscles that are represented in this area and are then showing an observable behavioral response to each TMS pulse. But depending on the parameters that you use, you can also not only stimulate a certain behavior, but can also disrupt it. This is a movie, and I hope the sound works via Zoom. I'm not entirely sure. I play it anyways, but what you will see is a journalist that visits a TMS lab, and he's getting his speech production area, Broca area, stimulated with TMS, but using parameters that are actually disrupting the spatial temporal activity pattern that is required to produce speech. And in this case, while he's trying to produce speech, this neural noise that is introduced into his Broca's area while he's trying to speak is not beneficial for his behavior. It's actually disruptive. So it induces some sort of non-invasive version of a speech arrest using TMS. I'll start the movie and hopefully you get the sound. If not, you have to take my word for it.
I'm Roger Highfield. I'm the science editor of the Daily Telegraph. Now, words mean everything to me, but now I'm going to have the speech area of my brain turned off with a giant magnet. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again.
So you see, and you heard that TMS is obviously not very painful. This gentleman had a lot of joy and pleasure while being TMS'd. And it's a very strange experience to undergo such a TMS stimulation when you're trying to get a word out and it just you can't get it out because you have this cortical block of neural disruptive neural activity in your language area and speech production area, in this case Broca's area. So you see two very simple examples how TMS using transcranially applied magnetic pulses to stimulate or disrupt neural activity in a certain area of the brain that you can target. You can target it very specifically by using neural navigation, fMRI-guided positioning of the TMS coil. So there's a lot of research out there, including from my own group. What we also know now with TMS is that TMS effects are not local, but they're spread along networks. And this is data that we collected many years ago, where we applied TMS during an fMRI scan. This is a technology or a technical setup that a few groups have achieved, where you can bring the TMS coil into an fMRI scanner and you measure actually brain activity changes at the moment of your TMS application. And we did this in a couple of studies since 2007. And the take-home message from all of this research is that when you apply TMS pulses to a given region in the brain, for example, the parietal cortex, the changes that you induce, they are not restricted or limited to the area that you target, which you might hope or think. No, the TMS effects always spread along connections of this area to other remote regions that you have not even targeted, but they are also affected because they are connected to the area that you stimulate with TMS. So TMS always have network effects. That's a very important lesson that we learned in the last 20 years. Every TMS application anywhere in the brain causes entire networks to be modulated by this TMS intervention. And the second very important take-home message is that those network effects of TMS are shaped by the state of the brain at which the stimulation is applied. So here the data in this publication from 2007 already showed that if I apply TMS to a particular region in the brain, while the person that is receiving TMS is at rest or is engaged in a cognitive activity, and this cognitive activity recruits this brain region that I'm about to stimulate, these two states of the brain lead to very different network effects of TMS. So the effects that TMS has on the brain is a network effect, and what network is affected is determined by the state of the brain at which in which the brain is in during the stimulation. We call that state dependency of TMS, or state dependent network changes of TMS. It's a very important insight that we also now use for our clinical applications, but I come to that in a second. Well, you now have this very nice technology, a non-invasive way of stimulating, disrupting different networks in the brain. It's painless, it has almost no side effects. The effects are immediate. So it's very, very tempting to use it as a research tool, and we've done that in the last 25 years to test different hypotheses that you have about which networks or which areas in the brain are functionally relevant for which particular cognitive ability. So you make some sort of causal brain behavior testing. And there are thousands of papers out there that did exactly this. They used TMS as a research tool to understand the functional relationship between activity in a certain brain region and a particular cognitive performance. And we've also done our contribution to that research line using those techniques as neuroscientific research tools like fMRI or EEG, but then turning the situation around, not measuring brain activity, but changing brain activity and measuring the effects on behavior. The funny thing about the last 25 years is that no matter what we did in our healthy volunteers, no matter where we put the coil and what parameters we used, what we usually found is that the network effects that we induced in the brain with TMS by, for example, targeting the so-called dorsal attention network, which is the bilateral frontoparietal network of the brain on the cortex. So it's a perfect target for TMS because it's on the superficial layer of the neocortex. So these are the areas that you can directly reach with TMS, something that I forgot to mention, that TMS has its limitations in the sense that the magnetic pulse is, the strength of the magnetic pulse is logarithmically decreasing with the distance from the coil. That means a few centimeters away from the coil, the magnetic pulse is too weak to actually induce electric activity. Therefore, TMS is more or less limited to the neocortex. But it doesn't matter because the neocortex is so well connected also to subcortical regions that due to these network effects that I told you about, you can also reach deeper into the brain via the connectivity, via the indirect effects. But focusing on this frontoparietal cortical network, the dorsal attention network, of which we know is very, very relevant for many cognitive tasks like attention, memory, cognitive control. So there's no doubt that these regions are involved in a couple of very, very basic relevant cognitive functions. No matter what we did, when we stimulated those regions in our healthy volunteers, our students, we could often successfully modulate their behavior, but always in the same direction. We always made them worse. We always impaired their cognitive performance. And for a long time, we didn't really care. We didn't mind because the most important for us was to find a very specific, function-specific and area-specific change in behavior, in performance. And whether this change is a positive change or a negative change doesn't matter, because it, in any case, proves that a certain area is relevant for successful execution of a particular function. And if these areas are specific and if the functions are specific, it's very valuable for understanding the relationship between brain and cognition. So we couldn't care less, and we did these experiments and we published. But still, after 20 years, you come to that point where you start to wonder, why are we always, if we have behavioral effects of TMS, why are they always negative? Why are people always getting worse in their performance in attention, memory, cognitive control task? And so a few years back, we tried to focus our research on that question: what are we doing wrong? Because these areas, these networks are relevant, we are stimulating them with different parameters, and still we never managed to make people better in performing these tasks. And one idea was that everything I just told you so far is based on a very simple conceptualization of how the brain works. I talk about areas, I talk about networks. So that's a spatial idea of certain functions are located at certain areas or certain networks in the brain. It's a pure spatial conceptualization of how the brain works. And also TMS I introduced as a way to change activity or induce activity in a certain area of the brain. But we know now, of course, that this is not how the brain works, and this is not how brain regions communicate with each other to form these networks. We know now that the actual processing, the coding, the communication within the brain is happening very much on a temporal scale. So not so much about the localization of a function in particular networks, but a very relevant feature is the rhythmic brain activity in brain areas, and how brain areas are synchronized or asynchronized in order to communicate with each other. In other words, a brain area is never just active or not active, like an on-off button. That's not how neurons code or process information, but it's rather that you have these rhythmic spiking activity in neuronal populations that follow a certain temporal pattern or rhythm. In this case, for example, you have a population of neurons. Each neuron is a dot, and you see that somehow they're like an orchestra. Together they decide to fire, and then they're silent again, and then they fire again, and then they're silent again, and then they fire again, and then they're silent again, all together. And if you plot this as a local field potential, you actually get these waves of rhythmic brain activity in this region. And if you count the peaks of these waves, you can actually determine the oscillatory frequency. It's an oscillation of rhythmic activity, neural oscillations. And in this case, if you count them, you come to 10 waves per second, or 10 hertz, which is the alpha frequency. And you all know that, of course, that these neural oscillations are very relevant and heavily investigated in neurophysiology and in animal research. And we have concrete ideas already about the functional role of these neural oscillations in the brain, also with regard to cognition. So many cognitive functions, such as attention and memory or cognitive control, not only activate this network, this dorsal attention network I just introduced, no, but they're also very much related to particular neural oscillation frequency bands, like alpha, theta, and gamma. And so far, I completely ignored all this because the fMRI machine is completely blind to these oscillations, because it has not the temporal resolution necessary to pick up on this fast rhythmic temporal activity changes. And also the TMS was just based on areas or networks, and then used fMRI to measure the network changes. It's also not really tailored or considering this rhythmic activity changes at all. And we thought maybe this is the missing key. Maybe by ignoring this important temporal structure of neural oscillations that underlie cognitive functions, that is why we actually, in essence, we can change behavior, but we cannot tune into that rhythm such that we improve it. We usually always mess it up. Everything we do is just messing this temporal structure up, and therefore the net effect of our TMS is always a behavioral impairment. So in the next step, we thought, let's change this. Let's not only understand which area of the brain is relevant and we stimulate it, but also in what temporal rhythm we need to stimulate it in order to really boost and improve this cognitive performance. And we started with attention. Spatial attention, as you may know, our ability to shift and control our attention in space. You fixate somewhere, and then the instruction is to voluntarily shift your attention to the left or the right side of space. And we can easily do this without moving our eyes. We can shift our attention system to the left or the right side of a visual screen, for example, a computer screen. And by doing so, we are faster to detect a target stimulus that appears at the side where we have shifted our attention to, and we are slower in reacting to targets than appear on the opposite side of where we don't have focused and shift our attention to, while still fixating in the center. That's our ability for spatial attention control. And it's a very, very important cornerstone of many other cognitive abilities. Well, we know now that in the healthy brain, if you do that, if you shift your attention to the right, then there's a particular change in the alpha, the 10 hertz oscillatory frequency activity, in the sense that shifting attention to the right increases the amplitude, the power of your 10 hertz oscillations in the right hemisphere, while decreasing the alpha power in the left hemisphere. And if you shift your attention to the left, the opposite happens. Then the alpha power in the left hemisphere is getting higher, and the alpha power in the right hemisphere is getting lower. This is what we see with EEG. You see here a map. This is another technique we need to use then for understanding this, because as I said, the fMRI device is perfect in showing us where the activity is, high spatial resolution. We can see which networks are implicated in this task, the dorsal attention network. The EEG could not tell us this because it's blind to where the activity comes from. But the EEG has a very good temporal resolution, so it gives us the additional information about this temporal rhythmic activity, and in this case telling us about the changes in alpha power between the left and right hemisphere, depending on whether we want to shift our attention to the left or the right side of space. So we have this additional information now. We know where, and we know the rhythm. The alpha rhythm is relevant for spatial attention control. And now in another experiment, we used non-invasive brain stimulation to bring all of this together. And here we used another technique, not TMS, but transcranial electric stimulation. And I briefly would like to introduce this technology to you. TES, again, is a non-invasive neuromodulation technique. That's why it's transcranial. But instead of an electromagnetic coil that sends magnetic pulses, we now just use an even simpler technology, namely a battery with 2 electrodes in the most simple form. You can also have more electrodes, but 2 electrodes is the most basic setup. And these electrodes, the anode and the cathode, they are just placed on the outside of the scalp. And then you have a very low intensity current of a few milliampere that runs from the anode to the cathode. And if this current that runs between the electrode is a constant current, we speak about transcranial direct current stimulation. So 2 milliampere running always from the anode to the cathode. That would be TDCS, transcranial direct current stimulation. And another waveform or another mode that you can pick in that device is also using TACS, or transcranial alternating current stimulation. And that is in essence, the exact same hardware and setup, but now instead of having one constant current flowing from one electrode to the other, like in TDCS, you now have an alternating current, changing polarity, going back and forth between these 2 electrodes in a particular rhythm. So you could say, I'm stimulating with 10 Hertz TACS. That means you're stimulating the alpha rhythm, the alpha oscillatory rhythm, by having the polarity changes 10 times per second. So you have this oscillatory sinusoidal stimulation curve with TACS. There's a lot of research also using this technology, what it does in the brain, what are the neurophysiological and behavioral effects, very similar to TMS, just much weaker, cheaper, and also portable, which has, of course, certain advantages for the applied side of things. And one important difference between TMS and TES, which is also sometimes the umbrella term used for both TDCS and TACS, TES standing for transcranial electric stimulation. One important difference in TMS is that it's not strong enough to really trigger an action potential, like TMS does, like really make neurons fire. It doesn't do that, but it can actually change the resting membrane potential, making an area less or more reactive to external or internal input. So you don't make them fire themselves, but you make the likelihood of them to fire to any additional stimulation higher or lower. And this, in essence, is the same thing, because we have seen that spontaneous activity always is also related to spontaneous firing rates. And whenever there's a change in the environment or internal mental state, there are also changes in the firing rate. And by modulating the resting membrane potential, you're actually shifting the firing rate towards being more or less likely to occur, which is very related to using TMS to actually change the firing rate itself. So we used this TACS idea. You see here in our setup 2 electrodes, a ring electrode, and a center electrode. So it was a bit different from the classical 2 electrode setup that I showed you. This is used to have a bit more of a focal stimulation area. We positioned it over the left hemisphere, the left parietal cortex, and we used alternating current stimulation with a particular frequency. And the frequency we used was the IAF, or the individual alpha frequency, which is the frequency in each participant that is measured with EEG, that shows the this alpha rhythm that I explained to you that is relevant for spatial attention control is a bit different in each participant. So it's 10 hertz on average, but some participants have an alpha rhythm of 9 hertz, others of 11 hertz. So in order to really individually tailor our brain stimulation to that particular frequency, we used EEG to first assess the individual alpha frequency in each participant, and then use the TACS neuromodulation stimulating the left hemisphere of these students with their own individual alpha frequency. That was our condition 1. And then we did a couple of control conditions to see whether any changes that we would find, any behavioral changes, are really specific to stimulating in this individual alpha frequency, or whether it's more a general stimulation effect. And therefore we had 2 control frequencies, which is the individual alpha frequency plus 2 hertz, and another condition was minus 2 hertz. So we're deviating, we are flanking the individual alpha frequency. And also we had a sham stimulation condition where people thought that they get stimulated, but in essence they had actually no brain stimulation happening. That was condition 4. And we did that on the left hemisphere, while people had the task to be able, in a computer task where we assess the ability to voluntarily shift their attention in space to the left or to the right side of their fixation. And please remember what I just told you. We know that the area where we placed the TACS, which is the left posterior parietal cortex, we know from fMRI this is an area that is relevant, that is active during this ability to control your attention in space. And we know from EEG studies that if the alpha power, so the amplitude of the individual alpha frequency, is higher in the left hemisphere, people are getting better in shifting their attention to the left side of space, because alpha power goes up left and goes down in the right hemisphere whenever you want to shift your attention to the left side of space. So our hypothesis was that if we now not only stimulate the right place, but we also stimulate it in the right rhythm, then now for the first time, maybe non-invasive brain stimulation could not only change behavioral performance, cognitive performance, but can actually change it in a good way, improving, enhancing these students' ability, specific ability to control their attention in space, and even more specifically, to be able to control their attention to the left side of space. That was the working hypothesis. And we tested this in healthy volunteers in Maastricht. First did the EEG to determine the individual alpha frequency, then did the TACS neuromodulation to boost and enhance the power of the left hemispheric alpha oscillations. We measured their behavioral performance in a spatial attention control task. And we did the EEG afterwards to also see whether we had measurable effects on the alpha frequency as assessed by EEG. So validating that our intervention also worked in the brain. And here are the results. First on the EEG. We indeed could show in the EEG pre-post measurement comparison that only in the condition where we stimulated the left hemisphere based on the individual alpha frequency with TACS, we actually did what we intended to do. That is, we increased the amplitude, we increased the power of the left hemispheric alpha rhythm in the brain, while the other 3 control conditions, so the stimulation plus 2 hertz, minus 2 hertz, and sham, did not have such an effect on the power of the alpha oscillations in the left hemisphere. So the EEG data validated that we were successful in modulating the left hemispheric alpha oscillatory activity at the right area and in the right rhythm. And now the big question, of course, is, did that really translate into enhancement in their ability to control their attention in space? Unlike the 20 years before, where whenever we stimulated those networks, we successfully modulated behavior, but always caused impairments. And here are the results. Indeed, in this data set, which is now published, I'm missing the reference, I just see, but it's just published a month ago or so, we could, for the first time for us, at least the healthy volunteers, systematically, hypothesis-driven, very specifically enhance these healthy students in their ability, in their cognitive ability to control their attention in space, making them better to shift and control their attention from fixation to the left side of the visual screen. And now comes already the question of application. We now have a tool, science-driven, evidence-based, non-invasively capable of enhancing a very particular cognitive skill. In this case, the ability of the attention system in the brain to control and shift attention to the left side of space. And via our cooperation with the Department of Neurology and Rehabilitation, we are very well aware of particular patient groups that suffer from exactly this deficit, from the inability to voluntarily shift their attention to one side of space, therefore ignoring everything that should be perceived on that side of space, suffering from so-called hemi-neglect, left hemi-neglect, for example, after stroke in the right hemisphere. You often see patients suffering, in addition to all the other deficits that they might have, they're also suffering from left hemi-neglect. So the inability to perceive and respond to anything from the left side of space. And here's a video showing such a patient, a gentleman suffering from right hemispheric stroke and from left neglect. And I show you this little movie clip.
Point at the finger that moves, okay? Or say both of them.
So the neurologist moves the right finger, no problem to perceive it, no problem there. Left, he doesn't see it, doesn't see it, doesn't respond to it. Comes closer to the center. Now he sees it. It's in the center now, he sees it. He sees the right, he sees the left. But if they go together, they're competing for attention. He only sees the right. Because if they go together in the competition situation, that attention is competing between left and right, the left always loses in his case. So he's suffering from left neglect after right hemispheric stroke. So we thought, okay, we have a tool that is very specifically improving exactly this deficit. It's not a perceptual deficit. The visual cortex, the eyes of this gentleman are perfectly intact. It's a pure top-down attentional control deficit in the attention system of the brain. So we brought this technology, this portable, cheap, simple to introduce technology into the rehabilitation environment. And we stimulated in 16 subacute stroke patients suffering from hemi-neglect, just like that gentleman in the movie. We stimulated their intact left hemisphere, so they had a stroke right, and we focused on the left healthy hemisphere. We applied these 2 electrodes of the TACS, high definition transcranial alternating current stimulation device. We stimulated the alpha frequency in order to again boost the left hemispheric power of alpha oscillatory activity in the frontoparietal network. And we tested this in a clinical trial, a placebo-controlled trial, these 16 subacute stroke patients. And we could see that in this proof of concept study, was not a therapy study, it was just one session of 20 minutes of TACS and a before and after assessment of their hemi-neglect symptoms and deficits. We could show that in the active TACS group as compared to the sham group, this is the difference between pre and post. You see in the sham group, people actually get worse in the post test. And that was very, very much due to fatigue these stroke patients are very tired. So if you do such an experiment with them, they actually will get worse throughout the experiment in any kind of cognitive performance. So the post-test after the 20 minutes of TACS was actually worse than the pre-test because they got tired by then. And that's why you see in the sham condition this worsening of their performance after the TACS. And in contrast to this, when the TACS was not sham, but alpha-based TACS, the alpha rhythm of their brain was enhanced, then not only did they not get worse, although the fatigue was just the same, but we actually made them significantly better in the ability to detect stimuli on the left side of space as compared to the pre-test, as compared to before the TACS intervention. And that was only true for the contra-lesional side, so for the left side of space. So we made them better to pick things up on the left side of space where the deficit lies. But at the same time, we didn't affect negatively the ipsilesional side, which was a problem of many other neuromodulation based interventions in neglect, is that you inhibit the contra-lesional side and people get better in detecting contra-lesional stimuli, but the costs are that they're getting worse in detecting the ipsilesional side, and then of course nothing really is gained. Here, this data set based on this rhythmic entrainment idea actually made them better in their deficit, but not on the costs of making them worse on the other side of space, the competing between the attention systems. This is very, very promising, and we are currently, we had these effects during the stimulation and even up to 20 minutes after the stimulation, just after one therapy session of 20 minutes. And we know for any kind of clinical applications, you need to repeat the neurostimulation several times across several sessions in order to have lasting effects. And this is exactly what we are testing now. We are rolling this out across a network of rehabilitation centers in the Netherlands, trying to replicate this and trying to not just do one treatment session, but 20, 30 treatment sessions over several weeks to see whether we have really lasting, longer lasting effects on their in their stroke rehabilitation. That's very, very promising. One important aspect about all of this, and I'm coming back to TMS, that and I already indicated this with the therapeutic applications, is that TMS or TDCS, both of them, not only have immediate effects while you're applying it. This is what I showed you before on the brain map. So you're stimulating the brain and you have an immediate instantaneous response, stimulation or an inhibition, depending on the parameters. But you can also, for example, TMS apply using so-called rTMS, repetitive TMS protocols. And also this is heavily researched for many, many decades now in animal research. And even in Maastricht, we did some vitro experiments where we stimulated neurons in a dish to understand what these different parameters actually do on a cellular level and a synapse on the synapse level. And we now know, as a take-home message, quite established, that if you apply TMS repetitively, and that means hundreds of thousands of pulses in a train of stimulation, that if you do that, you actually induce, you don't only have the instantaneous immediate effects of TMS that vanish once you stop the stimulation, but you also induce neuroplastic changes in the area that you stimulate that are outlasting the stimulation itself. And those neuroplastic changes that you induce on a synaptic level, they depend on the frequency with which you applied the rTMS train. And a very basic take-home message is that on average, we have so-called high-frequency rTMS protocols, which is classically 10 or 20 hertz. So 10 pulses per second or 20 pulses per second. And they cause long-term potentiation. So they actually make areas more active in the long run. So with lasting effects, you induce facilitation of activity. While when you stimulate the same person in the same area, but now using a different protocol, namely a low frequency rTMS protocol with classically is 1 hertz, so 1 pulse per second. Those low frequency RTMS protocols, they do the exact opposite. They lead to long-term depression on a synaptic level, meaning that even beyond the stimulation, you actually caused a lasting inhibition or lowering of neural activity in this area. So in other words, depending on the frequency with which you apply repetitive TMS protocols, and those RTMS protocols means hundreds, thousands of pulses, so you're stimulating for 20, 30 minutes in one session. Depending on the frequency, you can even make an area more active than before or less active than before, and those effects outlast the stimulation. They are lasting effects because they induce actual neuroplastic changes that are there, like you just learned a new trick. It's like these are learning mechanisms, synaptic learning mechanisms. And now, of course, comes, besides the findings I just showed you from the rehabilitation context, this is, of course, the reason why now for so many years, TMS is booming as a potential treatment for various disorders, because you have different neuropsychiatric disorders such as depression or OCD or PTSD, and you might have an idea or the beginning of an idea what is the pathophysiology of this disorder. So you have certain areas or networks from which you know that they are too active or not active enough, and this pathological hyper or hypoactivity is actually correlated with particular symptoms. If you have this knowledge, then it's a very logical step to use the different RTMS protocols, the high and low frequency RTMS protocols, to counteract this pathological state and try to make it reverse it into a normal brain state again by using high frequency RTMS over regions that are not active enough, or using low frequency RTMS over regions that are too active in a particular disorder. And this is why TMS, having these two different frequency classes and being able to position the coil flexibly above different areas of the brain, this is why TMS is such a versatile tool that's investigated in the context of so many different disorders. Many people often wonder, how is that possible that one therapy can be good for depression and OCD and PTSD and schizophrenia? That doesn't sound very credible. And it's a fair point. Also, the level of evidence for these different applications is very different. So we should be very careful in not overclaiming the clinical potential. But the scientific reason why it's investigated in the context of all these different diseases is because it's not just one therapy. It's very different therapies depending on where you position the coil and what parameters you use. You can do very different things in the brain. And that's why it's used in such diverse contexts. But by far the most or the best investigated application case of TMS is depression. I don't have to tell you this probably, but you know that depression is by far the biggest problem in the mental health crisis that we are all in at the moment. The numbers are actually increasing. It's more than 250 million people suffering from depression worldwide. And it's in any mental health system in the Netherlands, in Europe, everywhere in the world, an incredibly big problem, how to handle this mental health crisis. We have, of course, luckily, many effective treatments available. There's psychotherapy, there's antidepressive medication that is working very well, but still there is a problem, because even if you accumulate, so you add up all the remission rates of these different medications and different available treatments, we end up at around 67%. That sounds good, but it also means that at least 33% of patients are currently not responding to any of these available treatments. They're not responding to medication. They're not responding to psychotherapy. 33%. And this is not including the large amount of patients that don't want to or can't take medication due to the sometimes severe and unpleasant side effects of pharmacotherapy. So there is clearly a need to add a neuromodulation-based therapy to this mix, at least for the people that are clearly treatment resistant, so have failed 2 or more medication trials without any improvement in their depression. And one of these patients many years ago came also to me, to Maastricht, before everything was recognized and regulated in this space of TMS depression therapy. It was Hanneke. This is a picture of me and not Hanneke, because Hanneke didn't want to be in the picture. There's still, of course, this stigma with psychiatric disorder. This is my secretary. But the point is that we ended up treating Hanneke, who was 15 years chronically depressed, tried many different medications in various doses, other intervention, nothing worked for Hanneke. And so she reached out to us, and we treated her with TMS, and it became a big success story also in the Dutch newspapers, because after 15 years of chronic depression, we managed with our 6 weeks TMS therapy to get her into full remission. That means she was, after 6 weeks, fully free of any clinical symptoms for depression. And it was a very emotional experience for her, for her entire family, her husband, children, grandchildren. They all came to visit and brought gifts and everything to my research group. And it was more or less the beginning of something in Maastricht, where we decided let's focus also more on the clinical aspect of TMS, which of course was already ongoing in the world. As a bit of a scientific background, why that could work in Hanneke's case, in so many other cases, is that there is now the idea of a depression network, a depressive disorder in the brain, which has to do with a network imbalance. Targets are mainly the prefrontal cortex, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex in the left and right hemisphere. And there's some evidence, although controversial, that there might be an imbalance in this left and right prefrontal cortex, with the left prefrontal cortex being not active enough in depressed patients and the right prefrontal cortex too active and therefore out of balance. Based on this, probably oversimplified model, people developed different RTMS protocols for depression. And from everything I told you now, you should know that this would mean that they use a high frequency RTMS protocol over the left prefrontal cortex to counteract this hypoactivity, or alternatively, people also use low frequency RTMS of the right prefrontal cortex to counteract this hyperactivity there. And both approaches are used, both approaches work, both approaches are FDA approved by now. This is data from our own data set, where we not only stimulated Hanneke, just one person, like an anecdote, but of course these are randomized clinical trials, in this case 200 patients that we stimulated with TMS 20 minutes per day, 5 days a week for 6 weeks, so 30 sessions usually people need in these depression therapies. And you see in these treatment-resistant patients, that's important to realize, that the patients that don't respond usually to the available treatment of medication or psychotherapy, we had a response and remission rate of 66 and 56%. So every second patient actually was in full remission, treatment-resistant patient, and their sustained remission rate was also very high after 6-month follow-up. So you see also on a large scale, this is a clinically effective treatment. And this is the point I want to make. So all this research, 20 years, led to, in parallel already, to clinical applications that are validated for their clinical efficacy, placebo-controlled, multi-center trials, meta-analysis. They all very much speak the same language, showing that TMS definitely works for depression. Others are still under investigation, other applications, but for depression, there's also a level A evidence recommendation now from the scientific community, and that then causes changes. You are a researcher, you are in a fundamental neuroscience research lab, and you apply your findings in a clinical practice, but then you find yourself in the situation of how that could change the mental health policy of the country that you're in. And in the Netherlands, it did. So by having this data available and being able to help all these patients, the question very quickly arose, okay, we have proven that it works. We have shown that it even works for treatment-resistant patients. How can we get it into the health system? So you need to, what we did in Maastricht, we just opened a clinic in the academic hospital in 2019, before it was regulated in the Netherlands. We opened a clinic, we collected data. Also, other collected data has since 2008 already, 2009 FDA approval in the US and in Canada and so forth. And then we just sat together with the policymakers of our country, which are a couple of organizations that are deciding on the regulations and the rules of what should be offered in standard mental health care. And we just presented them the data, and we had many meetings. It took quite some time and convincing. But in the end, and that's maybe something that we can also discuss, in the end, what happened is that they changed their regulations. They included TMS as a regular care procedure in the clinics, in the academic clinics in the Netherlands, and also private practices can open now and refer to this regulation. And they even now together then, if the policymakers change this, also the health insurances are connected to this. So also the large health insurances started to discuss with us on the basis of which reimbursement schemes can be introduced. And this is also now been taken care of. So the basic health insurances is now covering the costs for this depression treatment with TMS in the Netherlands. So you don't have to have a private insurance, no extra insurance. No, the most basic health insurance will cover those costs. If you are treatment resistant, that means you have failed 2 trials. These 2 trials can be medication or psychotherapy. So even 2 failed psychotherapy trials would qualify you for TMS reimbursement. And these details, this is something you really, as a researcher then, as a scientist, as an expert, find yourself in a committee that discusses this lengthily with these policymakers, and you actually implement those changes in the country. Up to the fact that also now we have included a new profession that didn't exist in the healthcare system in the Netherlands. We included this profession, including the question of accreditation, qualification, quality insurance, and this is the so-called TMS technician, because it became very clear that a clinical specialist, like a psychiatrist, neurologist, is very qualified to have the indication and the diagnosis and the whole treatment plan of the patient, but it's not necessarily the person that needs to stand next to the TMS machine while the TMS treatment is happening, or pressing the button or programming the device. This is a technical skill, executing the TMS procedure, that can be very well done by a non-medical specialist. And this is what we now call a TMS technician. And this is also now clearly regulated what a TMS technician is, what kind of education this person needs, what kind of accreditation. And these technicians work under the supervision of a clinical specialist, a neurologist, rehabilitation doctor, psychiatrist. Again, a clear change in the policy system and in the health policy system of a country, driven by neuroscience research. And I would like to spend the last 5 minutes or so on just showing you that, of course, this is not the end of the whole journey. So we now have it in regulation. We have changed the health policy. We have changed the health insurance coverage. It's standard regular care. But of course, the research doesn't end. So it goes hand in hand still, in the sense that there are still many open questions. And one open question is, of course, why is one patient benefiting from it and the other is not? And can we somehow predict who will benefit from the TMS therapy? And the second open question is the question of relapse prevention. So we have a successful treatment somebody is in remission. But if we just discontinue the therapy, there's a very high chance of a relapse. And both of these questions are actively addressed in Maastricht and in many other places as well. I'm running a bit out of time, therefore I'm going a bit faster, and I'm happy to put this to the discussion part. What we've done in Maastricht is to put the three sources of information that I told you about, the EEG, the fMRI, and the TMS, the one giving the rhythmic information, the other one the network information, the other one is the actual neuromodulation technique. We put them all three together in one experimental setup, being able to simultaneously assess rhythmic activity, network activity, and TMS in one experiment. And we found out that actually the network effects of TMS, they are modulated by the brain state as indexed by the oscillatory activity of the brain. So it matters at which moment of the ongoing rhythmic activity of somebody's brain I apply a TMS pulse, because this is shaping which network effects are induced. And we actually showed this with real data. Using the setup, we could show that indeed, if you stimulate at a particular phase or power level of the spontaneous fluctuations of cortical rhythmic activity, this mediates the propagation of the TMS pulse through the network. And this proof of concept has been published in Nature Communications Biology in the motor system. And our next step is now to apply this in the depression network. So we want to individualize the TMS depression therapy by not just giving the same rTMS frequency to every patient, but to rather target with a coil the area that is most connected to the depression network that we actually want to stimulate, and then stimulate the cortical area, the prefrontal cortex, with a perfect rhythm that based on our scientific research will lead to the most robust propagation of our energy through the depression network. And this is individualizing the TMS protocol. That's one thing we do. And the other one is to avoid the relapse. We are working together with a TDCS device that has focused on developing so-called home use TDCS devices, the Plato Science medical device. You see it here. It's like a headset, and you can do then TDCS stimulation. And this we use in combination with in-clinic TMS after the successful TMS treatment in the clinic after 6 weeks, when people are, not coming to the clinic anymore, they're at home. They can continue stimulating those depression networks using the much simpler and cheaper and safer technology of TDCS that I showed you before, wearing this home use TDCS headsets, and their compliance and their correct use of the TDCS is cloud-based, monitored by the clinician remotely. And I have actually first data in depressed patients where we've done exactly this. And this data shows that it's feasible, it's tolerable, it works. Patients are actually doing that. And if I compare two groups that did maintenance psychotherapy versus psychotherapy with a TDCS headset, you see that actually, especially over time, the people using the headset are benefiting much more in terms of improving their depressive symptoms. Home use TDCS. And finally, this is a society that we started in the Netherlands, the Stichting Hersenstimulatie, or the Brain Stimulation Society. It regulates, we work together there as a network within the Netherlands to help each other and to get this policy changes through. So it was in my role as a former chairman of this society to negotiate with the policymakers and to implement an accreditation procedure. And we are now busy to establish something like this on a European level. So that could be something of interest for you as well, to join this initiative where we have various European countries starting such societies in following this example, and also meeting on a European level to share best practices and work together towards more European regulations and accreditation procedures. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm very happy to take any questions you may have now. Thank you.